Now, first and foremost, interesting article in The Telegraph just now saying that Donald Trump is set to stop Britain's deal to give away the Chagos Islands when he returns to the White House following criticism from Republicans. This is, of course, the news that we were supposed to be giving the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. And there was a lot of concern raised about whether or not this would make them vulnerable to China's eyes and ears in the area, considering there's a big US airbase. The Telegraph understands Nigel Farage, the Reform UK lead who's friends with Trump, voiced criticism to members of Trump's team. And legal advice questioning the wisdom of the move is also being pushed in Trump circles by pro-Brexit figures in the UK. Do you think that's the right thing to be doing? Should Trump sort of intervene and go, look, we've got military bases there and we don't want you to do this?
I can understand why Farage perhaps raised this. There's a lot of detail that I'm afraid Farage has missed out. We struck a deal there that we would actually hand over the islands when we're done from a military perspective. We've gone through the legal international courts here, the Conservative government and indeed Labour as well. We struck a deal to keep Diego Garcia. That's the concern for Donald Trump and indeed for me, because it's such an important part of the world for us to have a maritime base and to be able to monitor what's going on, not least in China. I'm less worried about where it actually might go, because the one country that didn't sign up here to the One Belt, One Road country is the very country we're speaking about. There isn't a relationship with China that is of a concern at the moment. It's a bit of detail that I'm afraid Nigel Farage, I think, has caught a bit of excitement about, because, of course, there was a lot of discussion here. What next? Are we going to lose the Falklands? Are we going to lose Gibraltar and so forth? A lot of nuance in the deal that's been struck. As I say, we've now got that for 90 years. The Americans are on board with that. They recognize that as well. But if I may, there's just the bigger picture of where Donald Trump goes. It has caught everybody by surprise. I remember in the last couple of weeks, I was in America myself. Certainly the Harris campaign was so huge. Perhaps the Trump result has caught everybody maybe even off guard, coming to terms with it. We've all got a view of Donald Trump, but I stress that America is our closest security ally. Our world has entered a very dark and dangerous chapter. The threats are growing. Global stability erodes. We must continue to work with America, and that includes this new administration under Donald Trump. And I'd really urge caution in second-guessing as to how a second Trump presidency will impact on the global economy and indeed international security, because in what it means for the war in Ukraine or the Middle East, or indeed the growing power competition with China, if we look back at those three areas, Russia, China, and Iran, there's been an absence of any grand strategies to do with all three. And I think that's the sort of work that we need to start doing behind the scenes. Let's go and impress the Americans that we are serious about European security. Most of Eastern Europe is already on 3%. We are not. It should be a NATO standard. That's the benchmark that I think Donald Trump will call for. So let's actually get ahead of that, show to him and to the Americans that we're serious about European security, increase our defence budgets to 3%.
I mean, the problem is, of course, the government haven't done that, have they? They've just done the budget and they're not planning to do that. And I suppose the other problem that we might face is how good relationships are going to be between Sir Keir Starmer and David Lammy and the Trump White House, especially given some of the things they've said in the past. Kemi Badenoch using her very first PMQs as new Conservative leader to demand that Labour MPs should perhaps apologise to Trump. Do you think that's necessary?
Well, I think that's probably looking backwards rather than forwards. I stress the wider geopolitical picture is that they are our most closest security allies. We rub shoulders, whether it be on the battlefield, on the factory floor when we're building military things, but also on the diplomatic corridors as well. They are so important to us. We need to start pausing and using such language that you're referring to and start listening as to what the Americans' concerns are about European security. Because right now, I can tell you from the conversations I've had with the Republicans and the transition team, they remain concerned that we're not doing enough to provide our own security. Why should the Americans continue to bail us out? It's 2/3 of the NATO budget is paid for by the United States. And Trump raised this last time he was actually in office. We need to do more, given the fact that storm clouds are gathering again. So let's take that initiative. Let's stop calling names. Let's actually show some affirmative action, some statecraft in strengthening the bonds between the United States and the United Kingdom.
I mean, one could say that at least finally, it seems to me that Sir Keir Starmer's got that memo. He spoke of having a hearty and fond call with Trump after Labour's criticism of the President-elect. Perhaps that didn't go to some of their backbenchers. Emily Thornberry, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, doing the morning rounds this morning, rather bemoaning the fact that we have a Trump presidency. Does Sir Keir Starmer need to really get his team in order and say, look, like it or lump it, this is now the leader of the free world. We've got a lot that we need to cooperate with America on, particularly issues of global security and indeed what he may choose to do regarding tariffs, which could have, blowback effect on our own exporters here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, as a chair of a committee, I was chair of the Defence Committee for a number of years. You've got to be very careful with what you say. It gets back to America, and sometimes it's not distinguishable between whether it's the government or indeed Parliament as well. It's just blurred into one view coming from the United Kingdom. So I really would urge caution. There is a clear winner here, unequivocal results here, not only for the White House, but I think also in the Senate and indeed the House of Representatives as well. I can't stress that we need to work with this new administration, whatever our personal views might or might not be. That is the critical thing here. We do not have that luxury because our world is getting more dangerous, not less. So we need to come to terms with the fact and recognize that we can work with this new administration. We've got a couple of months now of this transition period until the 20th of January to impress this new administration that we are serious about European security. So let's stop actually slagging off and making these nasty comments. That's not helping anybody. In fact, it's simply alienating the very voices that we need to be engaged with leading up to the 20th of January.
Well, and one of those big issues, surely, is action in Ukraine. David Cameron, when he was Foreign Secretary, rather credited with going over and speaking to Donald Trump, having a sit-down with him, and in turn, Donald Trump managed to twist the arm of Mike Johnson in the Senate to make sure that £60 billion worth of aid wasn't held up there and managed to get over to Ukraine. But the feeling is, and what Donald Trump has said himself, is he's going to potentially push for a deal, and what that might look like and whether that is plausible or whether that actually increases the security risk here in Europe.
Yeah, and that's what needs to be explained. We've done, I think, a good job in UK in providing support for Ukraine. But how we spell it out even to the British people or indeed the American people as to why it's relevant. I met a senator at the Munich Security Conference and asked him from Nebraska, I think it was, why are you not signing up to the 60 billion aid package that you just referred to? He said most people in Nebraska aren't even aware of where Ukraine is, let alone how to spell it. For the good burgers of Nebraska, that's not an important issue. So we need to make that relevant. So if Russia pushes forward into Ukraine, he won't stop there because there's an ideological battle taking place, which we need to spell out. Likewise, when we saw in the Red Sea with what was going on there, when those ships have to go around Africa, that affects inflation here in the UK. So making that connection between our economy and our security is something that we haven't done enough of over the last decade. And we need to make that clear to the Americans. It's in their interest for Europe to stay safe. If Europe doesn't stay safe, as you saw a couple of times last century, then it's problems for everybody, and others eventually have to get involved anyway.
Yeah, and it's interesting with Vladimir Putin speaking as we're talking, Tobias, at a security conference over in Russia in Sochi. We're going to see if we can sort of pick up some lines he might be saying. One assumes he may well be addressing the results of the American presidential election as part of that conversation. I mean, it brings me also onto the subject of Iran. You're talking about the Red Sea there. We know that it's the Houthi rebels who have been creating a whole amount of disruption to shipping, firing missiles at various cargo ships trying to pass through, and yet another of Iran's proxies. Do you think that American foreign policy with regards to Israel and Iran is likely to change under a Trump presidency?
Well, interesting. Netanyahu, I think, was the first to congratulate Donald Trump. But also, I met Donald Trump a couple of times. He's a no-nonsense person. He doesn't want to see America dragged into a war in the Middle East. Back in the 1950s, it was actually, I think, Eisenhower that turned around to Britain when the Suez crisis took place and said, "You are not going to drag America into war." That's talking to Britain. And that changed our entire approach with Israel at the time. And again, I think he's going to turn to Netanyahu and say, where's the strategy? Where's the end game? You're doing all this fighting, you're winning the battles, you're killing people, but what does stability look like? I'm afraid that leads into the point you've just raised. Iran. For a decade, Iran is allowed to be able to run roughshod right across the Middle East through Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, this proxy influence. Where has been the strategy to contain Iran's influence? And now you see Iran and Russia and China forming this coalition, this axis to mutually support each other. Very, very dangerous indeed. So there's a very unsettled 4 years that Donald Trump is about to face. And he can only face those international issues when he works in coalitions. And Britain should step up and be right there, ready to help.
I mean, one thing that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail was he pointed out the fact that he was responsible for the Abraham Accords. And I think they've actually, to some degree, well, one might say it's provoked Iran, but other people say it's paid dividends, because when we've seen Iran trying to launch barrages of missiles against Israel, neighbouring Gulf states have sort of stood in the way and said, we're not going to let this happen. We want stability in the region. But Donald Trump also said that, he was the one who would levy a huge amount of sanctions against Tehran to make it impossible for them to continue to try and weaken their tyrannical rule, kick the Ayatollah out perhaps, and return Iran to some sense of civility. Do you think the world is going to be safer under Donald Trump?
Well, only if there's a plan. Otherwise, it does become more dangerous. He took out Soleimani, who was the leader of the Quds Force, I think in January 2020. It was an incredible action of taking out the leader who's responsible for that proxy influence. But it wasn't followed up with a strategy to help Lebanon, for example. How different the world would have been had we supported Lebanon and perhaps removed Hezbollah's influence there. That could have changed the outcome of what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. Likewise with Hamas, likewise with the Houthis in Yemen as well. There needs a grander strategy as to where the Middle East is going. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the power competition, great power competition you've got with China, which is really where Trump wants to focus on. And then this linking up with Putin as well. That's the danger that we feel at the moment. That's the 1930s, 37 feel to the world at the moment. We require statecraft from our international leaders. And again, I stress, this is what Britain usually brings to the table. America likes hearing our ideas, our solutions, our potential directions of travel that we'd like to go. We can only do that if we can get in the room to speak with him. And you don't get in the room if you slate them off from afar in the UK Parliament.